Yeah.
All right, perfect. And we are live here, of course. Hello, Mr. John Urbancik. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing extremely well. Thanks a lot for joining me today. So no, this is great, and I especially appreciate you joining me on your day off of the day gig. Although I know for a man like yourself, where writing is a part of your soul, you never really have a day off. It's just an extra day that you get to spend more time writing. So it's funny because time really is a weird thing, especially this pandemic. But I want to say that I think I first came to know you, of course, through your DarkWalker series, your incredible DarkWalker series.
Hmm.
And I want to say that was maybe 3 years ago, but it feels like it should be a lot longer ago than that.
It was at least 3 years ago.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
yeah, because that's when the last of the DarkWalker books were coming out.
that's right. Yeah, I
And I
kind of was a
remember.
little bit late to the bandwagon on that. So,
It's all right.
yeah, I got up to speed real quick though. Yeah, that was phenomenal, and I think anybody that reads any of your work, all of your books are so John Urbancik. So you've got a real signature feel to all of them, where you've got the mystique, the magic, the darkness stuff of them all, and it's all very much you. So yeah, it was great to get into reading that stuff. And no, this is great. This is awesome. I've had a chance to interview you via the magic of the emails, I guess, a couple of times before, but this is our
Mhm.
first face to face chat, so it's very cool. It feels like
Yeah.
I know you pretty well already. So
I do too. I have known you for a while. We've just been talking mostly books.
of course, we are here to talk, of course, all things books and beyond. So the most recent book that you've put out that I've read at least, because I was thinking, man, it's been a little while since you put in any new books. I'm like, what's going on? Are you kind of slacking over there? Are you doing other things? Of course, you're always doing other things involved with books. And then the most recent one that I had a chance to read, thanks again for hooking me up with that, was La Casa del Diablo. Am I pronouncing that right? My Spanish is a bit rusty, and I don't have the book in front of me.
My Spanish is a little rusty too, but I believe that is accurate. La Casa del Diablo.
Perfect,
But so
perfect.
I can explain that the delay. It's been
Okay,
over a
please
year
do.
since I've had another book out
Okay.
of any sort, and I think that was the Night Carnival and the Choose Your Doom. Both came out
Yes.
about a year ago. And what happened was I started doing the day job in addition to ghostwriting, and I was ghostwriting westerns. And when I stopped doing the ghostwriting, I put together La Casa del Diablo and the other book that's about to come out, a fantasy collection called The Museum of Curiosities.
Yes.
So both of those have waited until I stopped doing the ghostwriting, which was all westerns. Well, no, there was fantasy in the middle, but it was westerns at the beginning, it was westerns at the end, and it was basically a book every 6 weeks.
Wow. So it wasn't just one book, then it was a whole entire series then.
I did 13 ghostwriting projects for that same person. Um,
Wow.
Four of them were fantasy. The other nine were all westerns.
That is incredible. That is incredible. So, and I guess I don't know. I mean, you have nothing to apologize for. You got to pay the bills and you are a writer. So that's the best way to do it for sure. But I know that would explain why you've been um, a little bit scattered, I guess, with with your newsletters as well. So I
Yeah.
was just thinking you're super. I mean, I know, of course, you're super
Well,
busy, but I figured you have other stuff on the go. So,
but there was not a whole lot. There was not a whole lot going on either to talk about in the newsletters. It's like, oh yeah, another week
right.
that I didn't do anything except ghostwriting and day job. So hope you're having a good week.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, repeat, repeat.
Now, the interesting
So,
thing with La Casa del Diablo is
yeah.
that is from the ghostwriting.
Hmm.
When I originally got the gig, I had to do an audition piece, a 5,000 word start of a novel. So the first 5,000 ish words of La Casa del Diablo were the audition piece for the ghostwriting gig. But I
Okay.
switched it up a little bit and I made it, weird.
Yeah, of course. Man, did that drive you crazy at all, though? I mean, especially knowing that. I mean, if I can recall the first 5,000 words, I mean, that would have covered, I mean, the whole book is what, about maybe 25,000 words or so? 30,000, 25?
I think it's about 20, somewhere between 23 and 28.
Okay. I couldn't not imagine if I'm reading a quarter, so about a quarter of the book, that I could imagine reading a quarter of it and then just saying, well, this is pretty amazing. I can't wait to find out what happens next. So I'm just going to put that aside for a year. Like that must have driven you absolutely bonkers, knowing that that's there waiting to be finished and to see where those characters where they went to afterwards.
Well, it served a purpose. It got me the ghostwriting gig, and I needed
True.
the money then. I probably
Yeah.
need the money now, but I don't have it now. So,
Yeah.
but but it served its purpose. And at the time that when we stopped doing the westerns and started doing the fantasies, and I moved here, I'm in the middle of Pennsylvania now.
Yeah.
I thought, well, I've got a little bit of free time. Let's see where the rest of this book goes. I thought it would be
Cool.
my final western, and then I ended up doing another, I think, four more for the ghostwriting thing.
Okay.
But it's the only one that's really mine. The ghostwriting had parameters and had particular needs that, or particular things that needed to be done.
Yeah.
Whereas this, the La Casa del Diablo, just needed to be me, and it really is. It really becomes me. It is definitely my version of a western.
Yeah, no, and I absolutely love that too. I mean, it certainly takes a huge turn. And I mean, and I think that it really appeals well to fans of westerns. I'm not going to go out there and say I'm the most hardcore western fan, but every western I've read, I've always really enjoyed them. So I definitely like that flavor of style, and I love the old spaghetti westerns are some of my favorite cinematic movie watching experiences. I think they're fantastic.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I also love what you bring to the table in all of your other stories. Where, and I know you've kind of compared this because of course you're good friends with Brian Keene. You guys have collaborated together as well, very effectively. But you've always compared yourself to him in a sense that he is the kind of writer that writes for the sole purpose of drawing out the fear in you, and your main purpose is to draw out that sense of magic, that sense of wonder.
Yes.
Although there certainly is a darkness to that wonder as well, which I find is fantastic. But this book, it starts off as your standard, standard fare Western, where, you've got the lone gunman. He's riding through the desert on a horse with no name. I don't think he actually did name that horse.
Actually, the horse's name is Roa, which
Is
is
Raw.
Roja,
Okay.
which is
Oh, okay.
Spanish for red.
Gotcha. Okay.
So,
That's
or
funny. I'm embarrassed I
kind
forgot that.
kind of Spanish for red. I'm not sure if it's really red or just, I don't know, something. I don't speak Spanish. It's hard for me to be certain. But yeah, the horse
Ro-
did have a name.
You're right about that, because I remember my teenager actually named a fish because it was a Siamese fighting fish that was primarily red, and they named it Roja.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right about, yeah. Okay, cool. It all ties in. I knew there was yeah, that's great. But it's fantastic because this guy's riding through the desert. He's a gunslinger. He's hell bent on avenging the death of some very near and dear people to him. But then he meets up some strangers, and then they sort of join up as far as the rest of their journey across the desert, and that's where it definitely goes very much into Urbancik territory, and 100% has your signature stamp all over it at that point. So, and it's just brilliant because for me at least, I'm like, I have no idea where the heck this thing is going, and I love it, and I don't care. I'm along for the ride. I'm sold, and it had that Western um, beauty to it, in that sense of the isolation and everything else, and it had that magic, that sense of awe and wonderment. Um, did it come naturally for you? I mean, was there a point where you thought, okay, I need to start putting my signature piece in this, or making the story really my own, and separating a little bit from what people would expect from a typical Western?
I don't think I ever really thought of it that way. I knew going in, when I went back to the audition piece, I was going to turn it into my Western. It meant it was going to be strange. It meant I was going to add dark elements. It meant I went in there knowing that it was going to take a turn that the ghostwriting would not have appreciated. This would not have worked for any of those projects.
And speaking of which, so when you wrote those first 5,000 words, obviously you're writing them to get the gig. Did you have an idea of what the parameters would be for those books of his or hers for that person moving forward? Did you write the first 5,000 based on that and then edit it later on to suit yourself?
I knew what the ghostwriting would entail, but I did not write those first 5,000 words intending to make my own story. I had to go back after in order to make sure that it fit the story that I decided to come. So there were some things that were removed and there were some things that had to be added to make that beginning fit the story that I ended up telling. Cool. It wasn't originally planned that way. But once I got started, I knew, not when I started the audition piece, but when I started going into it, knowing that it was going to be my piece,
yeah,
I knew what I wanted for the ending.
Okay. And is that common for you where you know the ending? Because I got the feeling for your DarkWalker series, I mean, I know that it wasn't intended originally as a series, but then as it became a series, I don't believe that you knew exactly where it was going. Correct me if I'm wrong, please, but is that...
I sometimes know where I think it's going. It doesn't always go where I meant to. Like DarkWalker, if it had gone the way I intended when I knew it was a series by the time I started writing book 2.
Yeah.
But I didn't know it was a series when I wrote book 1. But the series I had envisioned as I started book 2 is nothing like what happened. But things interfere and the world changes around you and your own world changes. I mean, all of that. The first 4 books were written before COVID. Books 5 and 6 were after my partner died and during COVID. So I was in isolation and I was writing about death. I wrote those. I wrote another novella about death that I'm in the process of trying to sell. And then to lighten the mood, I wrote The Night Carnival, which is still about death. So I don't know how I thought that was lighting the mood. But it was a much more whimsical tone than the other 3 projects that I had written, which was DarkWalker 5 and 6, and then that novella all back to back.
Yeah.
That was heavy. It was a dark period in the world, and it was a dark period in my life. So
yeah, I mean, book 5 especially was just so brutal and just violent, and everything of this that the DarkWalker loved and cared about was just, it would have been a mercy if they just simply died in a hail of bullets or something, but it was so much more terrible than that. And I'm like, this poor guy, like, just give this man a break. And then it didn't start off much better for him in book 6.
No, I felt bad about the start of book 5 for him. Because
just the start.
Well, I mean, I knew how it was going to start before I got there. I knew how it was going to end before I got there. Book 5.
Yeah.
Like I said, I often do, but it doesn't always go that way. But sometimes that helps me tighten the story as I'm going. Like that novella that I'm talking about. I haven't sold it yet, but it's called Clockwork Ravens, and it might be one of the tightest, strongest pieces I've ever written. And dark as hell.
Good.
But it's also very tight because I didn't start writing until I knew exactly how it was going to end. I knew the final scene, the imagery of the final scene, or not the final scene so much as the climax scene, because there's a little bit after that. And I knew how that was going to end. And once I had that vision, once I had the image of how it was going to end, that is when I started writing it. And I wrote that novella really, really fast. The first draft of that just poured out of me. It was like, people talk about bleeding, but this was like gushing out onto the, it was just unstoppable. Once I started, it just had to be done.
That's going to be one of the best feelings in the world. It's, it really sounded like that story in particular then was was a part of you and it was just waiting to come out, and it really truly was your story, it sounds like.
We'll see. We'll see what other people think when and if I sell it.
Yeah, perfect. Well, you sold it once, so hopefully it'll go again.
I did sell it once, yes.
So, um, regarding the Casa del Diablo, did you find that that was? I mean, obviously it's intentional, but did you find that that was a complication, or was that something you really had to think and plan out? Where, okay, how do I keep the Western roots that started this story, while diving into the more magical mysticism portion of it that I imagine you're really looking forward to getting to when you started the book?
I don't think I had to think of it that way. I don't think I mean, the characters are who they are, and they have to stay true to themselves, essentially for the entirety of the story. So it's not like I can have them do anything that would not be appropriate for a Western, because he is a Western character. So, he deals with the unusual in the way that I would think that Clint Eastwood would deal with the unusual if he faced it.
That's interesting you mentioned Clint Eastwood, because he was definitely a man of few words. He was a man of all action, but he was also a man of questionable morals. I mean, you might not have agreed with his morals, but he definitely had a fine line, and there were things that he wouldn't do, things that he had to do. And I found, where was Clint Eastwood or that type of you I guess really your gunslinging Western standard, was that something that you were always sort of thinking of? Like, did you have a rule book in mind for this character, or fleshed out specifically before you set about writing that?
I think in my mind, there's different types of Western and different type of Western characters. So you've got, say, the John Wayne Western,
Mhm.
and you've got the Clint Eastwood Western. And I disagree with one thing you just said. Clint Eastwood's characters, specifically the Man with No Name, had a moral code. It's not what most people would say is their moral code.
Right.
It doesn't match what you would expect out of a hero, per se. So yeah, he had a moral code, and he stuck to that throughout. And I was definitely, because the ghostwriting was all John Wayne style,
Okay.
I was definitely wanting somebody to be a little bit more brusque.
Right. Yeah. John Wayne was kind of the gentleman's gunslinger.
Yes. Well, the movies were different then. Society was
Right.
different then. What they would accept in entertainment was different then. And there were rules, whether they were laws or whether they were societal restrictions or expectations, were different then than they are in the 60s and 70s when you get Clint Eastwood doing it, and then different than they are now.
Yeah, very much. And it's such a cool thing too, I find, John, that it really seems that the blending of Western style is really get like I've been seeing a few more authors taking advantage of that and blending, their own styles along with that. I know, Thomas F. Monteleone had Time Walker, where he blended in time travel and dinosaurs and westerns, and then of course we've also have Wiley Yun, who of course has outstanding splatterpunk westerns, which works
Mm-hmm.
super well as also. What do you think it is? I mean, I could certainly give my guesses, but um, what do you think it is about the Western that makes it such a great backdrop for blending in those additional subgenres, if you will, between splatterpunk and magical and everything else in between?
I think what we have is an opportunity to take something that has it's an established genre with its own tropes, and to mix it with other established genres and their tropes, and to take elements that you wouldn't normally see, and combine them in ways that are fresh and interesting and new and unique. And they won't always be. 20 years from now, this will all be things that everybody has seen and done, and we've moved on to something
Right.
else. But there's a lot of that, and it's not just the Western. Well, Westerns are great because they're pulps. They're like adventure. They're adventure stories. They're a particular kind of adventure story, but they're great because of the same reason that like detective stories are great. You know, Philip Marlowe and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Nero Wolfe books, they're all sitting in a particular area, particular genre. We put Nero Wolfe in a situation. Nero Wolfe was if you don't know, was a
Yeah, I don't know him.
detective in the Rex Stout books. Um, if you put him in a situation featuring Lovecraftian creatures in his closet, it would make for an interesting story, but he would still have to be who he is. He couldn't do something that he wouldn't have done otherwise.
Right.
And so you get to do that and play with westerns. And you know the authors that you're talking. Tom is a little older, and Wally Young's a little younger than me, and there are a couple of others who are younger or about the same age as me who are going to the types of stories that we were seeing as children. You know, westerns were popular on TV in the 50s and 60s and being rerun in the 70s and 80s,
Yeah.
which is when I was growing up and when some of those people were growing up. So we're going back to the things that influenced us, that expanded, that opened our imaginations, and reimagining them in ways that no one's not that no one's ever done before, but that wasn't common then. So we're trying to do new stuff, I think.
Perfect.
And that's one of the ways to do it, you know, and the amalgamation of different source materials.
Perfect. And that works so perfect for you too, because you're all about the alchemy and blending different chemicals and senses and making magic and potions and all that kind of good stuff out of your writing. So,
Well, I've always been really bad, and by bad I mean good, at mixing genres. A lot of my stories have been mixes of fantasy and horror were the primary things that I wrote. But they've constantly been mixing genres. I say bad at it because for a long time that was not something you could sell. Nobody wanted to see that. They wanted things that were strictly fantasy or strictly horror. So doing something that combined that was not unheard of so much as unaccepted. So
right.
a
Because
lot
how do
of
they
people,
market that?
yeah, and I've seen that as a response. You know, this is great. I wouldn't know how to sell it.
Yeah. Yeah, which is thank God things are changing as far as that goes, and the smaller presses and the independent authors slash self publishers as well is making a lot more headway too. So there's a lot more flexibility and a lot more choices, I think, for readers to be able to make, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and you can still get new westerns, or you can still get straight horror, or straight fantasy, or straight science fiction, or mysteries, or whatever.
Yeah,
It doesn't take them away. Just
yeah,
add something else, something more.
yeah, and I love the fact that thank God you're able to sell that kind of stuff now because, I mean, there's so much love going back to your DarkWalker series. So much to love about it, but one thing that I was probably the most surprised at how much I did enjoy it is I think it was book 4, I believe, where I might be book 5, one of the near the ends or the middle ones. I'm being very specific here. Just trying to remember that, but it was regarding the fairies. So it was incredible because you had a topic, it was very existentialism as well going on, where you had threads, these existential threads that connected characters that some of them could see, some of them couldn't,
That was
which
that was
was that was book 5. Okay. And then you also had the fairies in there as well, which I've never been a high fantasy reader, although I've certainly read some of the stuff that I've enjoyed. If it's, I mean, good writing is good writing. It could be in a Harlequin book, although I probably would never know about it. But I could still appreciate it if it was good writing in a Harlequin book.
I've
But
the romances.
uh, and that's speaking of which too. I mean, you definitely have the romance element in the Dark Walker as well. I mean, that's you could even go so far if you're to really boil it down to its bare essence. It is ultimately a love story.
Yeah.
In a big sense of it, and I mean that's what drives a lot of the decision making of your Dark Walker in there, is love. And I love the fact that speaking of love, that you also had like these fairies in there, and I'm thinking, normally if I read a book and it's, hey, it's about these fairies and they meet up with this person and these things happen, I'm like, it's probably good writing, but it's not for me. I'm so glad that you tricked me by putting the fairies in there when I wasn't expecting it, and it works so well.
You want to know something? I don't remember the fairies.
That's
No,
awesome.
I wrote it. I wrote it, like I said, I wrote it at a dark time, and it came
Yeah.
out. What was that? Like 2 years ago now. The fifth DarkWalker. Fifth.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So since then, I have written most of those 13 westerns and fantasy things for the ghostwriting. I have written a bunch of things for myself that are still to come out. I have, including La Casa del Diablo is since then.
Yeah.
Even the Night Carnival was after that.
Okay.
So it's, I don't remember all the little details of some of the other books because it's been so long. And so when I reread some things every once in a while. I reread my first novel, Sins of Blood and Stone, recently,
Okay.
because it's been 20 years since that book came out, and it's actually time for the follow-up. It had to wait 20 years for a reason, and there is one or two people who've been bugging me about it, and I was like, no, it can't happen until at least 2022. Now
Okay.
apparently it's 2022, so I don't have a choice
Yeah.
but to go forward. So I'm rereading it, and I'm like, I don't even remember some of these characters at all, but they're still, I don't remember everything specifically, but I do realize that it's me. I do get the sense of it. I'm reminded of it when I go through, but I'm gonna have to look at DarkWalker 5 now, look for the fairies, and just see what it is that I did, because I don't remember what I did with them. Wait, was she a fairy?
Uh, yes, there was. Well, there was the fairy came to the Dark Walker as he was trying to sleep. He was part of a caravan.
Yeah.
So that would have been when they were about to go down into where were they on the way there? I'm trying to
Oh,
think, into the
that was book
mines.
that was book 6, wasn't it? The caravan is in book 6.
Okay, so yeah, that would have been book 6 then. I was trying to remember that. So that's right, yeah, because that's where they went on to. Um, that wasn't book 5, because I want to think that they ended up on Armageddon or in Shangri-La rather. Shangri-La was book 6.
Shangri-La was book 5, but they were in Shangri-La at the beginning of book 6, but the story
Yeah,
started there rather than ended there. I don't
gotcha.
know.
Okay.
I'll look. It doesn't matter.
Apparently, I need to reread it too. But no, the fairy she came to the Dark Walker as a way to try to. I think she was put up to no good by another entity, but ultimately she was trying to steer the Dark Walker off of his path, and it worked to a degree. So he went and followed her, but then ended up that. Sorry, minor spoiler alert, people. But it ended up that she was a trickster, and I believe she led him to a witch.
I do vaguely remember the scene now, and he met the old man down there, right?
Right, the old man, not the witch,
Yes.
the old
Okay.
man.
That is
Okay,
definitely book 6. It's early in book 6, and
okay.
yeah, fairies, I think, were often tricksters, and people forget that. And people forget that fantasy and horror have gone together, like, have been hand in glove for
Totally interchangeable, yeah.
centuries and millennia. The stories that are told in almost every horror story, unless it's a true horror, unless it's like a crime story.
Right.
Anytime you have a monster of any sort, it is a fantasy story. It's just a dark one.
Right. I mean, even like Dracula. I mean, you could say that that's a fantasy story
Yeah.
in a
You could
sense.
even say that's a romance in a sense.
Very much so, yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
Speaking of kind of, I guess, letting things go as well, John. I can only imagine, and to talk to you about the ghostwriting, because I was really curious about that too. Because I know I've chatted with some folks that have did a little bit of ghostwriting here and there, but I'm thinking, oh my God, 13 books for the same person as well. So I imagine there's all, they had commonalities to each of them. And obviously somebody that had very rigid expectations from you and what you wanted out of these books as well. Uh, what is that like for you? That must be like just going through all those books and then letting them, just being in somebody else's world for so long, but then letting that world go as well. Then you no longer have anything to do with it. I mean, that must be such a strange butterfly transition.
So that's a little bit complicated because I was grateful to have the work and I put everything I could into them, but
Yeah.
they were never really my stories. So, I as a writer, as an artist, I have a compulsion to do the work. I can't stop. If I were never to publish another word again, I would still be writing on basically until the day I die. I don't have a choice. Um, the ghostwriting didn't count. It didn't help that. So I still had the urge or the yearning to do my own stuff. I just didn't have the time or the energy to do my own stuff. So while I enjoyed doing the work and I was happy to have the work, when I stopped doing the ghostwriting, I immediately started. Um, I started doing my own work again, and I would say, like emotionally, psychologically, it was the hugest benefit to me. And this is why we have La Casa del Diablo coming out now. We have the Museum of Curiosities about to come out. This is why I'm working on the follow up to Sins of Blood and Stone and follow up to one of my other novels. This is why I'm able to. I'm also working on putting out my vampire novel. I guess that's news. Nobody knows about that yet.
Oh, okay. I was
Um,
gonna say my ears perked up. Speaking of Dracula.
so yeah, it's not a Dracula style vampire story,
Okay.
but I
And
wrote it.
nobody sparkles, right?
Nobody sparkles. No, no.
Good.
It gets very dark, but it uses a couple of different types of vampire tropes. It's not just. See, Anne Rice had a big influence on me when I was young, and so it's not just Anne Rice style vampires, although there is a little bit of that. There's also the Nosferatu style vampires in there as well, and the mindless, blood drinking beasts that are called vampires because what else are you going to call them?
Sure.
But they're not the same thing. They're not the same. And I might as well tell you more.
Yeah, please do.
The project is called Vampires in Madrid, and or Vampires of Madrid. I always forget what preposition I use, but it asks the question: why aren't there very many stories about vampires in Madrid? What stops the vampires from being in Madrid? You've got stories about vampires in Paris, Vienna, Rome, New
Sure.
Orleans, New York City, Boston. You've got vampires all over the world.
Yeah. Pennsylvania.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that I was not able to find very many that even touch Spain. I was living in Spain when I asked this question, so it kind of
Right.
makes
Fair question to ask.
there's a couple of the Anne Rice characters are Spanish, but the stories aren't Spanish and don't take place in Spain. They don't the stories are not set in Madrid. They're all set in the vampires primarily in Paris and New Orleans in her books. Um, so I just thought, there must be a reason. So
Now,
that I sought to answer that.
yes, and I was just gonna say, would I be a little bit off um, out of my realm here if I were to ask you what was the answer you came up with, or is that the entire? Or that just is that what the story is? Is the answer?
It's integral to the story, and I
Okay.
couldn't tell you now. But what I can tell you is, again, mixing the genres. It's part that, and it's also part romantic fantasy with time travel elements in it.
Oh, okay.
And in a way, the two stories merge.
Okay.
And honestly, it's the story of my experience in Spain. I lived there for most of 9 months with my partner, and that is where she got diagnosed with cancer. And just a couple of weeks after we left Spain, she died. Um, that experience, the entire experience, the good, the bad, is all in that book. So I'm a little afraid to start because I know I was in a dark place when I wrote it.
Yeah.
And I felt at the time that it was probably the darkest thing I've ever written. And I'm going to have to go and find out for sure because I can't just say, here it is. I have to go
Right.
through and make sure everything in it is right. I have to
No.
do revision. I have to do, if I'm going to
Okay.
self-publish this, I'll have to do the layout, and everything is just going to be me again, diving right back into it.
Yeah. Do you think that might help you to separate yourself a little bit emotionally from that if you do end up doing it through your dark fluidity? I don't know if I'd call that an imprint, but your publishing line.
Yeah.
Uh, do you think that would actually help you a little bit more emotionally because you're doing a lot more of the technical stuff if you decide to do it that way and all the layout and everything, or do you think that would just be something you'd be like, all right, I'm done, to give it to somebody else to do?
I don't know that it can help me emotionally anymore in that way because I think that kind of emotional work I've done. We're talking about something that happened a little over 3 years ago.
Right. Not that long ago. Yeah.
Not that long ago, and honestly, it's not completely done. She wrote a book herself, and it is just about to come out.
Right.
It's not.
Regarding Disney.
It's called the Disney Animation Renaissance. It's basically the history of the Disney Animation Studio in Orlando,
Okay.
and I got copies of that in the mail this week, or
Oh, that's
about a week ago, and
bittersweet.
yeah, I cried. Um, I wasn't expecting that. I wasn't expecting that reaction. So, obviously the emotions are still there. But I think because writing is the way I've always dealt with everything,
Yeah.
I think I could go into the story again and, make sure it's right and clean it up. Not to do more emotional work, but because I've already done enough emotional work to get in there. And either I'm right or I'm wrong. It could be that I'm in tears every night again, and that won't be fun or easy. But I'm still going to do it because what choice do I have? I don't have a choice. I told you that before.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
compulsion.
Yeah. And I guess that's just the power of writing as well as reading, I suppose, is that you just don't know, exactly what's going to hit you, when it's going to hit you, how it's going to hit you, and so
Yeah.
you're there, and then maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it gets stuff out that you didn't realize was kind of swimming somewhere down there under the surface and just having a jolly old time of leaving you alone until it's like, oh, yep, there's some light. I'm going to jump, swim towards that now and come out.
Yeah. It's a little early to be talking about that though, because I've still got stuff to do on that, and I have other things, that I'm working on that will definitely be out before that. La Casa del Diablo just came out. The
Yeah.
Museum of Curiosities, at the time that we're recording this, is less than 2 weeks away.
Not too far at all.
and
That's great.
and a few other things that are most likely going to be here before that book, including a book from Eraserhead.
Okay.
So
What
that
is it
is
called? Sorry.
Echo.
Oh, Echo. Okay.
Yeah, it's again, it's a mixing of genres. It's probably the most Eraserhead does bizarro stuff, and it's probably the most bizarro thing I've written. But it is essentially a story about magic, about a stage magician who finally does some real magic and switches places with his reflection in a mirror. Of
Huh.
course, the
Okay.
reflection doesn't live the same life that he does because although he has the same skill set as a stage magician, he is a professional thief.
Interesting.
And now they've both switched places, and so it becomes an interesting story. It's a
Yeah.
novella,
Okay.
and it's the first of 5 tightly interconnected novellas that make up a book called The Secret History of the Palace Theater, which is a book that I haven't sold and I haven't got any expectation of releasing anytime yet. But it is a mixture of genres because there's fantasy, there's like creation myth in there, there is cosmic terror in there, and magic, lots and lots of magic.
Perfect. That's really intriguing, and it's funny that you mentioned that story too, because I'm actually going through an audiobook, um, Dr. Jekyll or Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde currently. And as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, as far as like those sort of uh, duality of personalities that are competing with each other within the same person, I thought this is such a great idea. I mean, sure, you've got some scattered stories out there, but why don't you see more stories like this? And then sounds like Echo is maybe the answer to my question regarding that.
It could be. There's lots of Jekyll and Hyde stories, though. I mean, the Incredible Hulk is a Jekyll and Hyde story.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Um, we see that type of thing all the time. The duality, I think, is a common theme.
Hmm.
And now I'm blanking on like any other example.
Maybe,
but,
well, I know there's an older one too regarding Star Trek as well with Captain Kirk. He
mirror
kind of was fighting against his
yeah.
Right. I think that was when I believe Richard Matheson wrote that one, I think.
I think so. I'm not sure. I don't remember the title of that one, but they went back to that universe in other future Star Trek shows over and over again. A lot.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite ones that stands out. I'm not a Trekkie fan by any stretch of the imagination, but that one definitely stood out. So it was a good one. So
I've seen lots and lots of Star Trek.
Yeah. That's and it's funny because I have a feeling that you probably have just as many, if not more, trunk stories that are just waiting to get unleashed than you actually do stuff that is unleashed on the world. It's like you said, it's just in you to give.
I was talking to Brian the other day, Brian Keene, and we were talking about my Inkstained stories, and he said that he reminded me about them because as they exist, the Inkstained project was to write a story day every day for a year, and I did it for 3 years. 15 of those months have been released as little paperbacks that are complete of those 15 months. That leaves 21 months that have never been seen by anyone other than me. And that is mainly a matter of logistics because that's the time that I moved overseas. That's the time when I was traveling between places. Right now I'm living here in Pennsylvania, but my storage unit where all of those Inkstained books are, and those were handwritten, so they still have to be typed.
Oh, wow.
All of those books are 800 miles away in Florida.
Are they in some kind of protective coating or?
They're in a cardboard box buried under an oak tree.
The thing with you, John, is I'm like you could be telling the truth, and I would believe it.
Yeah, I could be telling the truth. I'm not. They're in a climate controlled storage unit.
Okay,
with a bunch of other things that need to be in a climate controlled storage unit as well, including most of my library. I have somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 books, and most of them are down there in that storage unit. Because I live in a small apartment now, and I don't have room for all of that.
Yeah, you would be able to navigate with that. That's kind of cool because I'm sure just as much of you is over there than it is with you here physically.
I only have a couple hundred books here. And mostly books I haven't read. So it's not like I can go back. I don't have any of my reference books. I don't need my reference books as much anymore because, I have the internet. I have whatever's locked away inside my head.
Yeah.
And let's be fair. I have Brian's library and Mary San Giovanni's library nearby and a bunch of other writer friends who are around. So if I needed something, I'm sure I could find it. Yeah.
Perfect. And speaking of stuff too, I'll use this as a segue as well. Speaking of stuff that's locked inside of your head that you've picked up all throughout the years of your life, your experience, all of your adventures and everything in between. As you mentioned previously, of course, you're soon going to be unlocking some of those things inside of your head to be able to share with other people through the boot camp workshop that is going into its 32nd year?
Is it that long?
I don't think it's been that long. Has it not been that long? It feels like it's been that long.
I don't know. I attended in 2007. And I think at that point it was less than 10 years old, which means it couldn't be 30 years old now. But it does mean it's probably close to 20 or 25. So yeah, this will be the first. Next year will be the first year I'm an instructor. I will be instructing with Brian Keene, Mary Sangiovanni, Maurice Broadus, Norman
Okay.
Prentice. I think that's all of us, but I might have left somebody out, in which case I'm really sorry. But the boot camp is like an intensive study program where we're going to spend several days uh, beating new writers over the head with things that they need to know. And lots of people came out of that program and went on to do things with their writing. And some people went to the program multiple times. But this is the first year that I'll be instructing, and this is the first year that it's associated with Scares That Cares AuthorCon. And this is the first year that Tom Monteleone is not running it.
Yeah, which is, I think he's, I know I had a chance to talk with him a bit about that a while back, and he has nothing but faith in the new direction it's going to be going in. So like he's just as excited that there will be some changes to it as well. What are some of those changes?
Approved of me.
Okay.
I know what all the changes are. The change, well, if nothing else, it's an entirely new roster of instructors.
Right.
And being associated with the convention means that we're going to go straight from that into a writing and reading event. So it's going to be not just an intensive weekend of study, but basically an intensive week of nothing but, let's be fair, nothing but reading, writing, and whiskey. So
that sounds good. Not necessarily in that order, not necessarily all the time, I'm sure.
No. Each of the instructors are going to have sets of like lessons. Like we're going to each focus on certain things. So I believe my lessons will be about world building. Okay. But I also believe that each of us will have private individual, I think semi-private, like small groups where we talk with the individuals about their particular stories that have been submitted to the program.
Okay.
It can be very hard to go through, but as writers, you need to be able to accept criticism, because even the greatest writers of our time or of any time are still going to get 1-star reviews. You need to be able to get through criticism, and also to understand the difference between criticism and complaint, or the difference between destructive criticism and constructive criticism.
Right.
So when you go to a program like this, it is constructive criticism. The idea is to make it better. The idea is to find the things that are working and highlight and accentuate those, and find the things that are not working and excise those, remove them entirely. It's kind of like applying makeup. I assume.
I'll take your word for that. Yeah, exactly.
But makeup is a kind of magic. It's a kind of magic. It's like glamour. So this is basically glamour for writers. Yeah. I like
That's
that.
awesome. With whiskey.
Tell
it. Glamour for writers with whiskey.
Yes.
I'm sold.
Yeah.
Now that you put it that way, I'm going to start trying to work my way in
there. The new whiskey by Glenlivet.
That's awesome. And they really will be writer's tears, I'm sure, that we'll go into the making of.
Oh yeah. But the point is that you come out of it better. I did it. I believe we're focusing on short stories this year. When I was doing it, one year it was stories, the next year it was novels, the next year it was stories and novels, went back and forth. And I was in there doing a novel, and the novel I was doing was Stale Reality, an earlier version of Stale Reality, which came out 6-7 years later. And a lot of the other people that I was in that class with, some of them no longer write, that happens, and some of them went on to sell their stories, sell their novels to some of the major publishers in New York. One or two of them, I believe, became comics of some sort, and I'm fairly sure at least one was sold into a movie. I don't know how big a budget movie it was. I don't remember.
Sure.
Because we are talking about something that happened 15 years ago, and a lot has happened in those 15 years, not just
Absolutely.
to me, but to the world, to both.
100%. The world, the industry,
So,
everything.
yeah, nothing's the same as it was then.
No, no, for better, for worse, and yeah, for all of it. So,
Yeah.
and I know one of the things that Tom mentioned regarding that is that I guess for him it wasn't a surprise, but one of the things that he found to be a commonality that I think he mentioned as more of a surprise to, I don't know what you call them, the boot camp bees, from the folks that were in there, the students, we'll call them the students, is
Okay.
that they felt that they had this great story only to get there to find out that they actually don't have a story. What do you find as far as new writers go? And I'm sure this is probably a question you get asked quite a bit, but I think we definitely have a lot of people that are watching this that are from all walks of life and experience who might be wondering what they may be doing wrong that they can improve on as far as their craft goes right now, to even qualify to be a student of something like the boot camp. Do you find that there's any big commonalities or common threads of being a beginner writer where you think you've got a great story, maybe you've got a great idea, assuming that even if your writing itself is mediocre, something can be improved on? Is there still something that you think, as far as a construct of a story, that a lot of people get wrong?
I think I this is going to sound weird, but mechanics is important. The way you tell the story and the way you write the story as you go through. And when I was young, when I was starting, I would do a revision of my story, and those first times it was like, all right, so I've got to remove the word that, because 90% of the time that is extraneous. It doesn't mean anything. He said that it was cold. Well, why doesn't he just say it was cold?
Yeah.
Or better yet, why not just he said it's cold? Or better yet, why not just shiver or something?
Yeah.
There's better ways of doing certain things, and some of it is, for me, a little bit about the musicality of it, the way that it sounds and the way that it works. And the mechanics play directly into that. And I think a lot of younger writers, and I don't mean this as a generalization, I don't mean younger people who are writing, but people who are beginning to write, no matter what age you are, haven't mastered the mechanics yet. They're not entirely familiar with how to say what it is that they want to say in the clearest and most concise ways. Clear, concise, and simple was the way that I would describe it. And so they sometimes get in their own ways with some of that. I've done some editing work for a variety of people, and a lot of times the edits are simple edits. It's, remove the word that, remove the word even, remove the word suddenly. Like, suddenly nothing. Suddenly means it already is not sudden because I had to get through that word.
Good point.
Yeah, there's ways of making it seem sudden without having to say suddenly. If you have to say it, you haven't done it right. And that's a matter that I don't think that that's a problem. I don't think it's a problem that you do that at the beginning, because everybody has to start and get through that. I know I did. I'm sure in my first stories, new sections were begun with the word meanwhile, or, on the other side of town. You don't need to do that. But it's a matter of knowing how to do that instead, and to know that that is, something that needs to be done. After the first rounds of revisions, and when I finally stopped using that in that way, then I found there were other things that I was doing consistently that needed to be changed. And then when I fixed that, there were other things. There's always something else. There's still things today. You're always going to have those words that you fall on as a crutch to get through. It's kind of like when you say so or or when you talk.
Those fillers.
Those fillers filter into the writing in different ways. So very becomes a filler word, really becomes a filler word, that became a filler word. When you get through those, when you start working through those, then you find that the stories become more tightly written. And when you can tell your story more tightly, then even an idea that's not wholly original can be better told and can become interesting, because a lot of ideas have already been done. It's how are you combining that with other ideas, and how are you telling the story? Because telling of the story is what to me makes it interesting, makes it engaging. So that I think the big thing with beginning writers at the earliest steps of their career is just that they need to write it right through the crap to get to that part of it, because everybody's got it. I mean, I heard, what was it? Everybody has to write 1,000,000 words of crap before they can write something good.
That makes sense.
I've heard that. I've heard things like you have to study for 10,000 hours or practice for 10,000 hours before you can be a master at something.
Yeah.
It's the same thing and the same theory. I don't know that the 1,000,000 words is a hard and fast cutoff.
Sure.
But I was definitely thrilled when I counted the words in Inkstained, and that by itself was over 1,000,000 words.
Holy shit. It's a lot of stains.
Yes, and I had been writing
Wow.
I had been writing novels for decades before I did that.
Yeah. That's incredible. So, which that might be why your ink stains are, for the most part. I mean, I'm sure we haven't seen all of them, as you mentioned,
I
but
haven't seen most of them.
yeah, and I mean, even the ones that you maybe aren't going to let us see are probably a small smidgen of the stuff that you will or are willing to let us see, because you've already put in the work to get to that millions. And
Well, Inkstained I thought of as an art project more than a writing project. So as weird as that sounds, when I put them together into those, they're basically a month. A little volume is a month. They tend to be about 15,000 words each. Good, bad, or ugly, whether it worked or not. The only kind of revisions I was doing was grammar and clarity, making sure it's saying what I didn't change any stories. I didn't revise anything major. All I did was make sure that it was clear and included everything. And I think that might be why I stopped where I did, because I think there's a story in the next month that I question. I would not write that story today. And although I wrote it in 2015, which is not that long ago, maybe I feel differently or I look at it differently than I did then. I don't even remember. I'm trying to remember how I felt. I don't even remember the specifics of the story or what it was that gives me pause. But there's something in the next volume that I'm not sure I want to share with the world.
And is that because of a certain message or a certain theme that you no longer associate or wish to be associated with?
I don't know if it's that, because I don't think my message or themes have changed, but I think it might be more a matter of language. Language changes. And even in a short time, words that I used at the beginning of my writing career that didn't carry a lot of connotation to them outside of what I intended, now are loaded words that have other connotations that don't work the way that they used to. And it's not even that I want to avoid offending people so much as I'm aware that this word has a different meaning now than it did then. And it doesn't mean what I intended for it to mean. And so I don't want to say something other than what I intended. I don't want it to accidentally say something that, if I want to offend you, you're going to know it, and I'm going to know it. If I offend you unintentionally, then I have failed in my job as a writer.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And do you find with some of those the changes of the connotations and language that you're talking about, is that, as far as their different meanings, is that more a result, do you think, of just your perspective has changed a bit, or do you think a lot of that has to do with the isolate, with our pandemic and what some people have certainly taken away from that? I mean, isolation certainly means different meanings.
I don't know that I would blame the pandemic, because language is fluid and always has been and is always changing. So words that meant one thing to one generation can mean something different to another.
Right.
And words fall out of usage and words come into usage. They're constantly adding words to the dictionary every year. They're removing words from the dictionaries because nobody uses them anymore. There are things that we say that, like idioms that have carried over, like let's blow this popsicle stand. Most people don't even know what a popsicle stand is, or if they It's not so much that they don't know, but they don't even think about it and can't see it. I can't see what
Right.
a man looks like, but it was a thing at one
Or
point.
get off your soapbox. I'm like, what are you talking
Yeah,
about? My
exactly.
soapbox comes in a bottle. I'm gonna fall over.
So mine comes out of a basement in Denver. I mean, or Boulder, whatever, somewhere in Colorado. Uh, but it's just a matter of things growing and changing, and it's
Yeah.
constant. It does that, and various things in society have changed that. So among those things is political correctness that has changed language, but that is
Yeah.
not the only thing, and language has been changing constantly. Shakespeare invented uses of words that no one had ever used before, and we still use some of those today. And some of the words that he used, people today reading it for the first time have no idea what they mean.
Right.
Try reading something in Middle English or Old English. The language is so different that it's almost impossible to decipher unless you know how to interpret the original language. So that's going to continue to happen, and it is always going to happen. It's a natural phenomenon. Language grows and shifts and changes. So the cause of a particular word, like I said, I don't even remember what word or what phrase or what thought it was in there, and it could just be me overreacting to something. But
No, I don't think so. I know, like Stephen King once mentioned, I think it was in Danse Macabre he made of one of the essays in there. He might have touched on this, so it goes back a number of years, but clearly it still stands the test of time from your perspective that you're explaining right now. Is that he always felt that one question that people just didn't ask him enough about was what about the language? He's like, nobody ever wants to ask me about the language. And then he, of course, goes into what to him the language meant. But then to hear you explain it the way that you did, it makes a lot of sense. And it's not something, I mean, I think a lot of it, for at least as from a reader's perspective, is very much a subconscious thing, but it absolutely changes your perspective. It changes the way that you're digesting what's happening and the meaning behind what you're reading and what's happening. And I find that absolutely fascinating, especially when you have a book now that you've written, 7, 8 years ago that you're not sure that you can stand by now because of that variance of the language and by comparison of what is maybe a better language to use now or how it might be conceived.
yeah,
I find that
and
fascinating.
it'd be great if I could remember exactly what it is that gave me pause on that. But I also partly stopped because it was timing. I was living in Tallahassee, Florida at the time, moved to Virginia. From Virginia, I moved to Spain. I wasn't carrying dozens of used notepads with me
Yeah.
on those kind of trips, and I don't have them all with me now. It'd be nice. I'd actually love to make that road trip and go down and pick up a box of my journal so that I could retype the inkstains and go through and finish that project. But
The Odyssey Part Two.
it's a 14-hour drive each way, and I don't have the time or the money to do that right now.
Yeah.
Maybe later.
Yeah. Stuff.
Maybe
Yeah.
next week. Who knows? Anything can happen. I mean, the world, like I said, language constantly changes. The world constantly changes, and my situation can constantly change. The way it stands right now, I'm not sure when I'm going to get down there, but that is at the top of my list of things to do and get.
And speaking of the fluidity and constancy of, hello, pretty cat.
That's my cat. He just jumped up and now he's jumped down.
That is one fluffy kitty cat. That's awesome. How many cats do you have?
Just the one. His name is Max.
Oh,
Yeah,
Max. Okay.
Brian's outdoor cat or neighborhood outdoor cat keeps having kittens, so he keeps trying to get me to take another. But like I said, small apartment, 600-ish square feet. I don't know that I've got room for another one.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that I live this far away because honestly, like these pictures of the cats that Brian keeps doing, he thinks, he does it unapologetically, of course, that maybe people aren't reading my newsletters for the cats, but here they are anyways because it's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
If I was closer, I'm sure that I would have at least twice. I've got 2 cats now. I'm sure that I would at least double that if I was closer because, yeah, that feral
we,
cat makes some pretty good babies.
we go to his place most weekends to play Magic cards.
Yeah.
And last week we had to come here because there were 8 cats upstairs and 5 cats downstairs.
Jeez.
It was just
Wow.
undoable.
Just like, for the crazy cat lady, but yeah, I guess Brian's reached that point in his life now where he's the crazy cat guy.
Well, they have they have they both had a cat, him and Mary.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, they both had a cat, and both those cats were there. And my cat lived with them for a while when I was driving across the country. When I came here, I took Max back. My Max, his Max died. Not too long after I took Max back. I took Max back before I came up here, but now that I'm here, Max is in the area again. And then that cat outside, not his cat, just the one that lives just under his
cat. Yeah.
Had kittens, and they kept 3 of those kittens, and then she had more kittens. So the first batch he managed to find homes for the others. Yeah. The second batch he managed to find homes for all of them. Now the third batch, he's running out of people to home them.
Right. He's gonna have to start giving away his bonuses with his books or something, and a free cat.
Yes,
as long as you're local.
He did manage to get that cat inside, the outdoor cat, and I know it's his story, really, not mine, but his intention is to get the cat spayed so that there won't be another round of kittens needing to be homed.
Yeah, and wasn't it too with his story that he actually caught the cat, which was very elusive, and finally caught it, but then his local shelter wasn't. I don't remember what it was. They weren't taking in any extra cats, or they weren't able to.
I don't know all of the details because
there's a lot of them.
There's a lot of them. Yeah. I know this. There's a lot of cats, and he's rehomed. He's found homes for most of them. Forever homes is how he calls them.
Yeah.
I know several of the people who have ended up taking some of the cats, and some of them are writers in our field, and some of them are people who are not related to this field at all. But he lives around the corner from me now, and I've known Brian for long enough that I am a character in his first novel.
That goes back. Now, was that term? No, that would be The Rising, I guess, right?
The Rising, yes.
Okay, yeah.
I am a character in The Rising. That's how long I've known Brian.
I'm gonna have to reread that again to find out which the character is. I'm guessing you die a horrible, gruesome death.
You'll know it's me, and so I shouldn't spoil his stuff, should I?
Well, it's an older book, so if they haven't read it now.
Yeah, but it's not an older book that I would be spoiling. The character based on me will make an appearance in the Labyrinth series, which he's in. I was
just gonna say, yeah, I know it's such a good. Yeah, I'm enjoying that series.
But all of his characters can make an appearance in that. No matter what happened to them.
Right.
Back.
Hey, Max. Max came back. That's great. Do we have time for one more question, John?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Awesome. No, I really appreciate this. I was just looking at the time, and I'm like, it just flew by like time does. You don't really need a simile for how fast time flies. It kind of explains itself. Time is just what is even time. So I know we were talking previously about, of course, the constant changes. That's what the only thing that is constant. The fluidity of the language and stories in general. And I love the fact too that you were also talking about some of the books you've got coming out that are primarily novellas, as is at least half of your DarkWalker series. You could almost, I know you refer to them as short novels. Some of them are probably closer to the novella range. And I personally love the fact that seems to be a real, I'm not going to say a push, because I think it's a very organic thing that's happened in the industry. And I'm sure you already know my question already regarding the trend of novellas, how I think it's a great thing for readers. It's an easily digestible thing. I think it's a great thing for writers, especially those that are self-published, because it gives for more marketing opportunities, because you can do more novellas in a typical year than you can for novels. But what do you find is the biggest push with novellas, and why is it now that they used to be almost impossible to sell, at least to a publisher, and now they're encouraged, it seems.
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, because I think the story is as long as it needs to be, and if the story turns out to be a novella, then that's what it is. I usually have, because I've been doing this for a while, I have a generally good idea of how long a story is intended to be. I know if it's a novel or a novella or a short before I start. But as to selling or being able to sell them more now, you're still not having the big New York publishers doing a whole lot of novellas in genre. You're not seeing a lot of horror novellas coming out from. Oh, well, that's not even true, because like Tor has a whole line of novellas now. But a lot of that, I think, is pushed on the small presses that have been doing novellas now for 20 or 30 years, have been doing those smaller books. Cemetery Dance did a bunch. There were a bunch of publishers in the early and later 2000s and into the 2010s that were doing that size book. So now you've got a bunch of publishers who are able to, focus on that size. Eraserhead does a lot of the shorter novellas and shorter novels.
And Death Head Press is, they're
Press
doing very well with it too.
Most of the splatter westerns have appeared to be shorter. Not all of them, though. I know a couple of them are not just full-length novels, but long novels. Yeah. I think it's just more of an openness of readers to allow those types of experiences to be part of what they do. It doesn't hurt a small press to put out a novella, because there's enough people who are willing to read novellas, and that is just not because of anything that has changed so much as it might just not have made sense financially for big publishers to do that in, say, the 70s or 80s,
right?
Because there was money to be made in the novels.
Yeah, and that's what I always wondered about too, is the fact, especially since, I guess, with the fallout of leisure, and it definitely seems like the tides are turning a little bit. So I don't know if I'd use the term creator economy that way. But it seems like there certainly is a lot more smaller presses that are really taking the reins on, certainly within the horror genre.
Yeah.
So much more, I think, than some of the big press, although obviously they're always going to be there. And of course, the big presses, to my knowledge at least, is that they're concerned about their ROI compared to, the shelf space that their books are taking up in a bookstore, whereas a small publisher is very direct to consumer. So they don't have that concern really of, well, geez, we can have a book there that's going to get us $6 per book, as opposed to the same amount of shelf space that might get us a lot less. So I wasn't sure if that was the push, or if it's the TikTok mindset where we've got less of attention span, or.
I think it's a combination of factors, because you have less shelf space because there's less bookstores. You have more online options for buying books than you ever did before. You have places like Amazon that kind of pushes it. It's almost designed for smaller works, and the way people consume media anymore. A lot of people are reading this stuff on Kindles or tablets or on their phones, and I did that. I read was it Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is like a 1,200 page book. I read that on my Kindle. That took forever, and it was noticeable because I didn't have any idea of how I was progressing through it. It's got a little percentage marker, but there's something visceral about having the actual book and seeing that, I'm only, say, this far into the book that I'm reading right now.
Right.
So, that's a factor, but it's no one factor that plays into that. It's a lot of different things. Horror specifically works really well in a novella format.
I think so. Just fast, lean, mean, and leaves you wanting more. Or
because horror is very visceral, it's very emotional, and it's difficult to play out an emotion over 5 or 6 or 700 pages. Whereas in 100 pages, you go in, you paint the picture, and it can be a gut punch, which horror often is.
Yeah.
Or it can leave you wanting more, which it also often does. I describe DarkWalkers as novels because the Horror Writers Association and the Science Fiction Writers Associations define those by word count.
Gotcha.
Those categories. So the word counts of the Darkwalkers definitely short novel, but over that cutoff for novel. But I always thought that the shorter length had a lot of room for room for exploration, a lot of opportunity for discovering, and I'm not even sure, discovering new and different kinds of stories that maybe we haven't done before. And it's not like we haven't done it before either. I mean,
just in a different way.
Yeah, look at things like the Portrait of Dorian Gray. That's a novella. That's not a novel.
Yeah.
Lots of books in the 40s, lots of pulp books in the 40s and 50s, and 60s. The fantasy books, excluding things like Lord of the Rings, which is thousands of pages. Well, great,
Yeah.
built out. You had a lot of stuff that was coming out where the book lengths were typically in the 200-ish page range. That's not much. That's not much different than the Darkwalker books. I was aiming for that pulp feel with the Darkwalkers. I aim for that sometimes with other things, but it can still allow for something longer. Like the vampire novel I was talking about is close to 90,000 words, so it's double any of the Darkwalker books. The novel I was talking about earlier, Clockwork Ravens, that is just shy of that novel marker. I mean, 1,000 words off. It's almost 40,000 words, which makes it a novella, just like La Casa del Diablo, but it would be almost double the length of that. All of those novellas in The Secret History of the Palace Theater, which I shouldn't be talking about yet because it doesn't exist yet. All of those are. I
was going to say that I haven't heard that one before.
Mentioned it earlier with the Eraserhead story, Echo.
Right. Okay.
Is the first novella of that. It's a complete story all by.
Okay.
But the 5 of them together, all 5 of them are about 20,000 words each. It's that length is I'm not going to say it's easy to write to, but it's easier to wrap your head around as a writer and as a reader. The problem is that some readers, and this isn't a problem, but some readers don't want to wrap their head around something that's really going to be quick and easy. They want those 1,000, 1,200 page epics. They want that full deep dive in. I don't have a problem with any of that. I tend to write shorter. Even my short stories, that collection, the Museum of Curiosity, is coming out in a couple of weeks. It's mostly fantasy, contemporary fantasy. There's some really dark stuff in there, but its average length of a story is about 1,100 words.
And you've got 69 stories in there?
69 stories in there,
okay.
Yes. Yeah. Cool. The oldest one is a dark fantasy story called Bone Island that I wrote the first draft of in about 2003. But the majority of and that one's close to 5,000 words. Okay. But the majority of the stories are shorter and also written in the last couple of years. In fact, many of those stories have been since COVID was a thing. Okay. And many of those stories were since my partner died. But this is not a collection about death. There is death in there, but it's not the theme.
Cool. And I really enjoy collections like that too, that have that variety as well. Especially somebody like me. I mean, I'm for a guy that reviews a lot of books, I am a slow as molasses reader. I try to read really fast, and I just can't. I just can't do it. It's just not in my DNA to read books fast. I mean, my girlfriend can she'll sit down an 1,100 word book and she'll have it done in a few hours, and it's disgusting, really. But I'm the opposite. So I love a book or a collection that has a nice variety of stories as well. So I can feel, I can really dive into a longer short story, but then get a sense of accomplishment. Hey, I just read this story and it only took me an hour or what have you, or half an hour or whatever the case is. So I do appreciate that.
Well, this collection are short introduction, and the introduction's only one page.
Oh, okay. I can work with that.
Like some of them are longer. Bone Island is about 5,000. Stone Gods and Ghost Brides is about 3,500 words. And then you've got one that I wrote when I was living in Spain called Day of the Dragons. That one's about 1,200, 1,500 words, maybe 2,000.
Okay.
But then you've got a bunch that are going to be in like the 600 to 700 word range. It's a good variety, and I think thematically they all fit together pretty well. That was my question for first readers. It's like, I want you to read this, and I want you to come back, and I want you to tell me which story should I get rid of.
And how many stories did it have originally?
It was originally the first
that first readers would have read.
First told there were 67 stories.
Okay.
I decided it should be 69 because it's a fun number. And
yeah.
So I pulled 2 more, and then I rejected 3 of those stories and pulled 3 other stories. But most of the stories that are in there are Patreon.
Perfect. Okay.
So the readers rejected nothing. They gave me reasons why they didn't, but they did not reject, which tells me, because I do trust my readers, it tells me that I'm not making a mistake. Thematically, all of these stories do belong together.
Perfect. So you've got it in you.
Well,
awesome.
So,
sorry, say that again. You broke up a little bit there, John.
But you haven't seen that one yet, so
no, I want to though. I'll be looking forward to checking that one out. So a little bit down the road. So 2 weeks. That actually balances out very, very well with my my current pay cycle. So I will be ordering that one. So yeah, no, I look forward to that. Which I guess leads me to my next question here then. And I guess sort of wrapping things up here, John. Where is the best place to get all of your writing? I mean, I know, of course, you do have Patreon. I get your newsletter, so you always give shout outs and handy dandy links to all of your stuff. But if somebody wanted a one-stop shop to finding all things Urbancik, where would they go?
That would be tough because there's things that are just not.
I was going to say if there is such a thing.
there are things that are not available anymore. Like the first thing I did with Brian was called the Rise and Fall of Babylon, and you can get the individual stories. Both of our stories have been republished somewhere else in our own collections, but you can't get that book anymore. You can't get my initial collection. You can't get my first chapbook because that stuff is just out of print, and I don't know that it'll ever be back in print. But if you're looking for my short stories, the new ones coming out, I've got a couple of new stories on Patreon every month. And if you're looking for the books and to catch up, because I've got 50 or 60 of them out there, then Amazon or any other bookseller, because they should be available pretty much anywhere. So Barnes & Noble probably has most of them. If they're in print, Barnes & Noble will probably have most of them. I guess if you're in England, Waterstones would have them, or is that Canada? Waterstones would have them.
Nope, that must be England.
So to England, it's Canada, it's Chapters, I guess.
Chapters.
I'm just trying to think of names of chain bookstores because I know they'll have them. But you also get the occasional non-chain store that's going to have them. Like there's a shop in Tallahassee that, at least for a little while, had a few of my books because I was a local author. Yeah. There's a shop in Richmond because I lived there for a little while that has some. There was a shop in Spain that had one of my books at one point.
Cool.
I know
you got footprints all over the world.
I've been to a lot of places. I was writing about that earlier today, that I don't actually belong anywhere. I'm originally from New York, but you wouldn't really call me a New Yorker. And I'm in a place now where if you haven't been here for 4 or 5 generations, you're an outsider. You're new. So
That's crazy.
I don't belong anywhere, so I'm just a wanderer.
Yeah. I don't know if you quite call it a nomad because that seems like you're very directionless, but you've got direction. It's just wherever you set your sights on is the direction.
Yeah, I belong. I think what I said earlier today to my friend was that I belong to the wind. But now that I've said that, that's going to inspire a new set of poetry, which is going to be probably in the next collection of poetry, whenever that is. Bound to be in the works, I'm sure, right now.
Perfect. Well, I know, of course, based on what you mentioned in Inkstained, everything is inspiration.
Yes.
So, and
Everything can be.
yeah, absolutely. And you give examples of that all over the place. Simple things, major things, subconscious things, dreams, everything you put into your books, and I think that's what makes you urban sick. I practiced that so many times, and the very last one I
You
messed
did it
it all
right
up.
throughout the whole rest of the show.
I know that's so. I'm totally gonna edit that out.
That's all right. Nobody gets my name right. There was that one person that spelled my last name right and misspelled my first name.
Oh man, the H was silent, was it? Or non-existent?
The H backwards. It was John. They thought. Like
Interesting.
That doesn't
Johan.
I've never seen that, except for that. That time or typo.
Yeah, that might have to be your a pen name.
Nah, I don't know. When I was young, when I was a kid, when I was in high school, I thought it would be really great to write a collaboration with one of my pen names that nobody realized that I just wrote.
That's a great idea. Speaking of Jekyll and Hyde.
Yes.
He is everywhere.
I haven't done it yet, but how many pen names do I have?
Only you know, and they.
Only I know. Well, they might know, but some of them might not know about the others. They could be just like, personality.
Well, the pen names know.
Some of them might.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, speaking of magic and all things wondrous, I really appreciate this time here, John. You have no idea. It's been a pleasure. I don't know what tech took us so long to finally chat. So it's exactly because of conversations like this that I thought I need to start my own podcast so I can have an opportunity to have these great conversations and share them with everybody else that's watching this, and that I know will glean just as much from them as I do. So thank you.
Thank you.